Hey guys, how's everyone doing today? This is not a new format for videos, so do not worry about it. We're not changing a thing for 2021. We are still going to have tons of amazing whiteboard videos and interviews with all your favorite individuals on FinTwit and entrepreneurs and people in the personal liberty space and real estate investing. But for this evening's video, I wanted to go over a new format for a new YouTube channel that I started today called Rebel Capitalist. It's just where I go on 2 or 3 times a day and do quick news stories that I think are relevant to everything that the community as a whole really values. And that's personal liberty, that's freedom, that's entrepreneurship, investing, macroeconomics, and helping you build wealth and thrive in a world of out of control central banks and big governments. So for tonight's video, I wanted to recreate this format that I'm using on Rebel Capitalist, the new YouTube channel. And if you guys are interested in subscribing, I'd highly suggest it. My objective is for it to be like a video version of Zero Hedge. So if you're interested, I'll put a link in the description below. But here's an example of the type of content that you can expect on Rebel Capitalist. So let's dive into this article that I just found a couple days old here, a day old, and it's from MarketWatch. Fed has been successful at convincing markets it will be more dovish down the road, Bernanke says. This goes back to what Jeff Snyder has been saying for years. And he always talks about this on the Making Sense podcast and whenever I speak with him on the Rebel Capitalist show. And he's adamant that the Fed is in the game of expectations policy. They don't have much control, direct control over the markets because the only thing they can do is print bank reserves as the system is set up now. Of course, we all know that the system could change in the future to where they could turn those bank reserves into legal tender. The way the system is set up now, that's the only thing they can do. So they have to rely on the commercial banking system to leverage that excess balance sheet capacity to give loans to financial institutions to then go into the market, drive prices higher, and then bring in the retail investor, which we have definitely seen. And that goes into tomorrow's whiteboard video, which is going to be all about the stock market bubble, more specifically the SPACs, that the more I read about them, the more insane they get. I did not realize just how bananas the market was getting. But boy, oh boy, once I dove down that rabbit hole, my eyes have been opened. So let's keep going through this article. Federal Reserve appears to have succeeded where other central banks have failed, at least in convincing markets that it'll be more dovish in the years ahead, said former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke. Let me translate that for you. Central banks are impotent, but the Federal Reserve has convinced everyone that it isn't, and that there is a Fed put, and it has succeeded at expectations policies where other central banks have failed. The best we can tell, the Fed's forward guidance, both in terms of change and its framework, in terms of its commitments, have been fairly effective. During a discussion about economic policy during the cerveza sickness at a economics meeting, let me try to find another one of his relevant quotes. In August, the Fed announced a new policy framework saying it will attempt to overshoot its 2% inflation target. Now, keep in mind, and this is something that Jeff has told us and pointed out many times, that they can't even get to their 2% inflation target. So how are they going to overshoot it? Now, I know a lot of you are saying that, George, the CPI is a lot higher, and I totally agree that in the real world, prices are going up more than 2% per year. But this is just based on their measurement. So based on that CPI measurement, they can't even get it up to 2%, let alone increase it above 2% or let it run hot the way they measure it. So how should we expect them, or how can we expect them to achieve these objectives when they haven't been able to achieve them over the past 10 years? And I would argue that no major central bank has, when you include the ECB and the Bank of Japan. But somehow the market sees them, or is now taking their word at face value. And then the Fed goes on to say that it's going to be even more irresponsible to try to. And so why are they doing this? They're trying to get people to take more risk. They're trying to get people to go into risk assets because they're worried about inflation. And the Fed thinks that inflation equals growth, equals real growth. But as you guys know, that's not the way it works. We can get inflation and have negative real growth, just like the 1970s. But for some reason, the Fed thinks that inflation equals growth. Therefore, all you have to do is get inflation and you'll also get growth. And we know that's complete nonsense when you look at it in real terms, which is what we should be concerned with. I mean, look at all the growth they've had in Venezuela or in Zimbabwe. Tons of nominal growth, but the society is dirt poor, and the economy collapses as a result of all that growth. And they go on to say that they're even convincing the primary dealers that it indicates that market participants broadly believe the Fed has moved into a more dovish direction and that inflation will be higher, unemployment will be lower when the Fed lifts its benchmark rate above zero. But when? When are they said that they're not going to lift the rate above zero for years. So how can we tell? Look at how much different 2020 actually was based on what we thought it was going to be in 2019. I mean, think about that. Could anyone have predicted what we've experienced in 2020? Yet for some reason, we're supposed to assume that we know what's going to happen 2 and 3 years down the road, and that the Fed is going to be at zero or they're not going to be at negative. I mean, who knows? It's just bizarre that we would put so much confidence in central planners when they have just failed miserably at their own goals so many times in the past. So, and then here we go. Financial markets don't see rates being increased for something like 4 years, Bernanke said. Bernanke said the Fed's monetary policy has had beneficial effects since the pandemic started wreaking havoc on, of course, what's he going to say? And I don't think it's that the Fed's monetary policy has made a big deal. I think it's the government's fiscal policy, and these primary dealer banks are seeing inflation coming down the road, not because of what the Fed's doing, but more so what the government is doing in tandem with the Fed, that the government is spending all this money out into the economy and the Fed is monetizing it. Another chart I went over to show that, let me go off on a tangent here real quick, is the Fed's balance sheet as of today, up at 7.3 trillion. This is a chart I went over in another video today on the new Rebel Capitalist channel. And I've gone over this in several whiteboard videos. You can see it just go parabolic and then straight up to the right. It's increasing, though, quite substantially. I mean, in any other time frame, we'd be freaking out about this, even this mild rise that we see here. But what's interesting is when you compare this to the M2 money supply, and I know there's a lot going on in the shadows. We've talked about that several times. But look at how there's all of a sudden a correlation between the Fed's balance sheet and what's happening with M2 or broad money, at least the way it's measured. There's much more of a correlation than there was before. We see this line just pretty much going straight up directly. When we go back to the Fed's balance sheet, it's kind of all over the place, right? But all of a sudden here in 2020, we see a pretty tight correlation, which would imply to me that, or which would mean to me that the Fed is monetizing all of these treasuries that the government is producing by this deficit spending, and that is translating directly into an increase of currency units in the real economy. Bank deposits that are out there chasing a smaller amount of goods and services. Why? Because we have the cerveza sickness. We have all these supply chains breaking down. We have people being paid to stay home and not go to work. So how can we expect there to be the same amount of goods and services when all these people are being paid to stay home? In my opinion, that's going to be permanent, whether it's UBI or some form of that in the future, continued stimulus, whatever they want to call it. And so you've got to see this, and I hate to use the word stagflation because we don't know what's going to happen in the near term. It's impossible to know what's going to happen a year or two down the road. But I just think that 3 years, 5 years, with everything that we're doing right now and the misallocation of resources, the malinvestment, how can we not have structurally high unemployment with a reduced amount of goods and services and an increased amount of currency units? And I totally understand that a lot of that is predicated upon the commercial banking system creating more money supply. But I think they most likely are going to change the system so the Fed can circumnavigate, or the Treasury can just get around the commercial banking system and turn these bank reserves into legal tender. And so then they're going to actually have control over M2, and they're going to sit there and just crank up the printing press, baby. Then we've got true money printing by anyone's definition. But that was a bit of a tangent. So let me go back to this MarketWatch article and make sure that so then Bernanke goes on to talk about how the Fed did a great job because we were expecting GDP to be down by 6.5%, so a negative 6.5% on a year-over-year basis. Now the Fed expects it will be less than minus 2%. So if you just looked at that headline number, if you're watching this on CNBC or Bloomberg, you'd say, oh my gosh, wow, the U.S. economy, I mean, it's not that bad. It's very resilient. Look, these lockdowns didn't do a thing, or what we did to combat the cerveza sickness, not a big deal. I mean, shoot, the economy was only down by 2%. Right. GDP was down by 2%, but we had to spend $5 trillion in deficit spending. We meaning the government. And let me say that another way. The government had to misallocate $5 trillion worth of resources, present and in the future, in our economy to only have GDP, nominal GDP, go down by 2%, right? That's a better way to say it. And just think about what GDP would have looked like if we wouldn't have taken on additional $5 trillion in debt, which, oh, by the way, is the same amount of debt that the government accumulated in the first 220 years of its existence, from 1776 to 1996. So if we would not have done that, then GDP would have quite literally been $5 trillion lower than it was. So where would that put us? At negative 20? I mean, you're looking at a depression that would have been bigger, most likely, than what we saw in the Great Depression in the 1930s. If it wasn't for the government coming in and just spending all of this stimulus money into existence. So my point is that didn't fix the economy. It goes back to that example of the heroin addict that I always use in my whiteboard videos, where just because you come in and print more money for the heroin addict, that doesn't make them any better. In fact, it makes them worse because they're going out and buying more heroin that's getting their body and their mind addicted more so to the drug. So all we're doing is we're just creating this environment where we're injecting more and more heroin into the economy, and we're making our economy more addicted to the stimulus. That's what we're doing. That's not a win. That's losing. That's a massive fail. And at some point in time, you're going to have to pay the fiddler. So my point with this article is, number one, let's remember that the Fed, unless we change the system, which I think they most likely will, the only thing they can do is print bank reserves. It's all about expectations policy. Let's also remember that what they're doing now with the government, with the deficit spending, monetizing the debt, seems to be increasing M2 money supply substantially, at least what we can see in front of us that's not in the shadows. And then longer term, let's remember that in order for the government to prop up the economy, since the economy is now built on stimulus, we're going to have to continue with these massive deficits year after year after year. And, the debt to GDP just this year went from 100 to, let's call it 130. Next year, what's going to 150, 175? And pretty soon we're going to be close to Japan. But the difference, I think, is that we're going to turn those bank reserves into legal tender. So how does that play out for your portfolio? How does that play out for the dollar? How does that play out for commodities long term? This is what you should be thinking through, in my opinion. So for more content like this, check out the new channel, Rebel Capitalist. We'll put a link in the description below. Come back to the George Gammon channel tomorrow night for our regularly scheduled programs, the interviews and the whiteboard videos. We'll see you guys tomorrow.